You've spoken eloquently in both your, can we call it your inaugural address when you started off as dean of Harvard Divinity? Let's call it that, even if we can't. Your inaugural address.
Not quite up to Lincoln's second inaugural.
Yeah. Okay. So no, I won't compare it with that. Although,
thanks.
But you know, I looked at that talk, and then I also looked at a talk you gave, a graduation speech you gave at Queen's University in Belfast, and in both of those you talked about religious literacy, and you alluded in both of them to your own experience in Belfast. And one of the things that I was intrigued by was you were talking about living through the Troubles in the 70s, was how your whole intellectual trajectory was sort of set there in terms of trying to figure out, trying to explain what was going on. Could you say something more about that from a personal perspective, about what you experienced and then how that filtered into your own work as a scholar?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a great question. I think, I was a teenager in Northern Ireland in the 60s, doing what teenagers did. I played sport, I dated girls, I listened to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. I went to my pretty nice grammar school. I had aspirations of what I would do with my life. And the 60s looked like it was a civilized Western European country. Things looked pretty normal. It was distressing to me how quickly that normality was stripped away. I still remember vividly the civil rights marches and the police beating down of those marches, and then the growing violence between working class Protestants and Catholics, burning people out of neighborhoods, a kind of ethnic confessional cleansing. And I remember very vividly the first person who was killed, and I thought, well, that'll be the end of it. People will see sense now. That's a bad thing to happen. 4 years later, there were over 1,000 people killed, and still moving along. So I discovered there what a lot of people will tell you about the Balkans, Bosnia, what people will tell you about central Nigeria, what people will tell you about other places, that veneer of civility seemed to be stripped with surprising speed and viciousness. And it was shocking living through it, actually. And I suppose I had a vague idea that there were people going to, because the educational system in Northern Ireland was segregated. Protestants went to their schools, Catholics went to theirs. So I knew there were Catholic students out there and that they were doing this or that. And we didn't meet, and we only played sports against Protestant schools. So there was very little intermingling of any kind until university, which was virtually 50% Protestant Catholic at Queen's. So, and I'd been educated absorbing the assumptions of a British educational system. I read English literature. I read British history. In a Catholic school, you'll read Irish history, and you'll read Irish poets and novelists. So everything was really different. And so when this veneer of civility was stripped, it was a shocking thing. And I was instantly interested, I think, in doing my PhD research on how this worked, and started working on evangelical anti-Catholicism. That's what I started working on, just to try and figure out what drives this stuff. And in a way, the passion to find out, and what has driven my scholarly career, I think, because otherwise I think I'd have become an accountant or something other. But and I'd be not sitting here and probably in my yacht somewhere in the Mediterranean. But the passion to find out, what were the factors that could produce such divisiveness. And at the time, I said this to one or two people, at the time I thought that I was really living in the last war of the Reformation. It was the 30 Years' War, 300 years too late. that it was an offshore island of an offshore island that I was living in, and this was the end of it. Once this problem was sorted out, that was the end of it.
Mm.
So I actually thought I could just get out of Northern Ireland and leave it, and the rest of the world would be better. And I was wrong about that. It wasn't long after that we had trouble in the Balkans. It wasn't long after that the Iranian Revolution and a different configuration in the Middle East, and then all of the things we know about 9/11 and so on. So far from being the end of a cycle, it wasn't the end of a cycle. And there was something about living through it that I think helped me understand, the very complicated dynamics that go into these conflicts. So that is, I think, driven my curiosity.
So what do you think you learned about evangelical anti-Catholicism, to just take that narrow band of the problem? I mean, what kind of conclusions did you draw about that might explain that, that piece of religious conflict?
Which again is complicated, and to boil it down very quickly, the Protestant population in Northern Ireland got there by migration from Scotland and England, and a little bit by conquest as well. People were settled there by England. And in the 19th century, as Roman Catholic nationalism grew strongly on the island, Protestants became more committed to evangelicalism as a kind of more enthusiastic religious defense against the Catholic threat. So there was an anti-Catholic charge in evangelical Protestantism in Ireland right from the start. And there was a link between evangelical Protestantism and the Orange Order, for example. A lot of evangelical ministers were leading figures in the Orange Order. And I used to go to these orange marches as a kid, and you'd watch these giant banners that were held up in front of the marching bands and the orange lodges. And they would have things on it like, the Bible, the secret of England's greatness, or Queen Victoria, Empress of the world, and you would have an Indian native bowing in front of her. Or you would have the great ships built in the shipyard, which was virtually a Protestant ghetto, where the Titanic was built, and so on. So evangelicalism was a cultural system that explained Protestant superiority in religious language, that God had a special vested interest in the evangelical Protestant mission in Ireland to convert it to Protestantism. So the charge was there right from the start, and then of course it had many overlayers. That Roman Catholicism was a priestly religion,
right?
Whereas we could just read the direct word of God. So that's how it worked, and of course.
So what's the cart and what's the horse in terms of, because in your explanation you're talking about culture, you're talking about nationalism, you're talking about religion, you're talking about economy, you're talking about immigration.
Right.
Those are all parts of your explanation, right?
Yeah. See how good a teacher he is?
So, no, but
I didn't even know I said that. So much more intelligent.
But that. So there you go with the multi-causal explanation, right? But so is religion then this way to and evangelicalism then becomes the sort of religion squared, right? The hyper-enthusiastic religion.
Right.
So a more enthusiastic way to hate those people you want to hate, quite apart from religion, but it gives you a transcendent explanation for it. Or does religion have a kind of power of its own to sort of whisper in the ear that you ought to hate those people more because you don't hate them enough because God hates them more than you do. You should hate them as much as God does.
Yeah.
I mean, what's your sense of that? Of the place that religion plays in that hierarchy of those 5 explanatory categories that you came up with?
That's a great question. I didn't think that evangelicalism, as preached from pulpits, maybe with the exception of Ian Paisley's pulpit, which had a very strong anti-Catholic charge, but most ordinary Presbyterian, Anglican, other kinds of evangelicals I think the anti-Catholic charge was more hidden than overt. You almost needed to have a look at the historical conditions that created it than it was really in your face. Mm-hmm. So what I believe about these conflict zones is that as historians, you see the way they're built up from settlement patterns, ancient fault lines, old enmities, mm-hmm. That are almost deeply within the cultural DNA of places. And if you talk to people in the old Yugoslavia, for example, payback from what Croatians did in the Second World War or whatever it might happen to be, or you talk to people in Myanmar and what the Rohingya Muslims are doing or whatever. So there's always a kind of, there's always a kind of almost like sedimentary deposits over many, many years. Mm-hmm. And then there comes something that blows it open. Now, those are the interesting things for me. So what blew it open in 1968, 69, 70? I mean, one way of thinking about it was that it was a worldwide version, or it was part of a worldwide campaign for civil rights. So the same as the Martin Luther King Jr. here. And there was the same kind of police resistance and brutality. But here, Martin Luther King Jr. and the people around him, John Lewis and others, really hit strongly in this non-violent way forward. In Northern Ireland, when the civil rights movement emerged, with some of the same causes, equal citizenship, mm-hmm. non-discrimination in government, singing the same songs, Joan Baez songs and so on, same police brutality. But there, what gave it the charge was that there was an available violent tradition to plug into, the IRA, and in the Protestant side, the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, and the Irish Republican Army. So these people then mobilized themselves in paramilitary organizations, and then you had armed young adult males standing off, and this is always a dangerous group in any community. So it's possible to imagine a scenario where if the Northern Irish state had reformed itself, if the leadership of the civil rights movement had taken control and it had been a non-violent movement completely, if Protestants hadn't reacted so brutally through the police and B specials and so on, there may have been a different result, but there may not have been. It's the same with what's going to happen in Nigeria. It's as you know, a place with almost equal numbers of Muslims in the north and Christians in the south. Well, will that in 20 years' time be a broken state? Or will there be ways that leaders will find solutions to that problem? And I think that's an open discussion. Even in somewhere like Myanmar, if it does democratize and the military begins to move aside, how will that Buddhist Burman majority treat its religious minorities? Will it have the capacity to build a state that everyone can buy into? Or will these kinds of, episodic, surges of violence keep disfiguring the landscape?
And what makes the answers to those questions so tricky is that you need economists and political scientists and political theorists and religious studies scholars all in the room to make sense of those things.